Well, in recent weeks, the spotlight has shone on the failure of many Western governments to adequately address the unfolding refugee crisis. Less attention has been directed at the wealthy Arab states along the Persian Gulf. 6 Gulf countries, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman and Bahrain, have offered 0 resettlement places to Syrian refugees. And this despite these countries' relative proximity to Syria. Now, to unpack this, we have in the studio with me live Jennah, who is the Executive Director at Afro-Middle East Center, who joins us now. Thank you and good evening, and thank you for joining us. Now, Saudi Arabia and the wealthy Arab states, all along the Persian Gulf, should certainly be doing something about this. Yet they've been indifferent to this problem. What do you say to this?
No, absolutely. I mean, they should be. Let's just put one or two things into perspective first, though, Mahendra. One is that Bahrain actually has some refugees. I mean, okay. Nothing in big numbers. I think it's 25,000 or something. But there's 9 million Syrian refugees. 6 million of them within Syria itself, internally displaced. The other 3 million, essentially, Turkey has more than 2 million. Lebanon, with a population of 5 million, has 1.1 million refugees. Jordan has 1.4 million refugees. Bahrain has a few. Iraq has a few thousand. Iraq has, I think, a 250,000. A few other countries, including Algeria, for example, etc. So, as a whole, Middle East countries and Arab countries in particular are not ignoring the issue. But your point is about these particularly rich Arab countries, and no, they're not doing anything. In fact, in some ways, as much as we might blame on the one hand the Assad government in Syria and ISIS on the other hand, many of these countries that you just mentioned are responsible for the crisis in Syria because they're funding one side or another in the civil war that's taking place. Now, of course, there's the question of would Syrian refugees actually want to go to some of these countries? Partly because they are parties to the conflict, they're involved, they're funding, etc. If you go to one of these countries as a refugee and then you want to return home, depending on which government is there, what does that mean, etc. But that's not to make any excuses for these countries. The point, of course, is that even in Europe, and Europe is now talking about 150, 200,000, okay, which is small compared to what these other countries are taking. But in Europe, the reason that the policy is moving is because you have civil societies which are able to influence, push, cajole their governments. Yes. Now, that happens in democracies. Right? In Iceland, the Icelandic government said they would take 50 refugees. Within 2 or 3 days, ordinary citizens, 10,000 people, said they would open their own homes for refugees out of a population of 330,000. So the difference is created by people on the ground and their outpouring of support. Now, in dictatorships, you don't have vibrant civil societies, you don't have anyone calling their governments to account, and all of the countries you mentioned are dictatorships.
Sure. Now, some argue that the West has the responsibility to deal with the crisis because of the Western involvement in the region. They say that the crisis has been caused by Western involvement. Do you think this assertion is correct?
I think it's partly correct. Partly correct in that, yes, I think that certain Western countries certainly do have a responsibility for what's happening in Syria, for what's happened in Libya, for what's happening in Yemen as well, by their allies, etc. But I think the responsibility for the refugees belongs to all of us. And it's a human catastrophe. Certainly there are some countries that we might say bear more of a responsibility, even bear more of blame, but bear more of responsibility. And the richer ones among them, whether they're in Europe or they're in the Persian Gulf region, bear even more responsibility, but it's a responsibility of all of us human beings.
And what about those who say that the refugees pose an extremist threat?
This is, yes, okay, on the one hand, you have 9 million refugees, how do you decide who's who, right? So that's true. The issue is that this is a humanitarian disaster. And whether if you need to put into place security measures in order to make sure that this doesn't happen, then fine, you need to put those things into place. But you can't condemn 9 million people to death because there might be a few extremists. I mean, even if you take the whole of ISIS, how many tens of thousands of people are there fighting in ISIS compared to 9 million refugees? So that really is an excuse in order not to do anything.
And then there's the argument that that the countries in the Gulf feel that America and Europe are absorbing opposition and citizens who are not contributing to their, to the empowerment of ISIS. And so why should they stand in their way?
Yeah, I mean, all of these are real political arguments that at the end of the day don't make too much sense, frankly. If you want to address this as a humanitarian disaster, of course there's a political dimension. The Syrian crisis is a political and a military problem, and it needs to be solved primarily at the political level. But the humanitarian disaster cannot be excused through such political argumentation.
And there are these questions about the positions that have been taken by the Gulf countries, but nobody's asking questions about who is behind this.
Who is behind?
The crisis.
Well, I think that's not entirely fair. I mean, I think those questions are being asked. The issue is that, and again, the 9 million refugees I spoke about,
yes,
were there for the past couple of years. It's now come onto all our TV screens because 100,000 tried to get across to Europe. Right? But the questions have been asked, and the questions have attempted to be answered. The issue is, however, that in terms of solving the crisis, there really isn't sufficient will on all sides to solve the crisis in a way that would alleviate not just the humanitarian problem, but the political problem itself. I mean, even the United States, for example, is not really interested in countenancing a solution that sees a change in the Syrian government, for example. So it's all about politics, and the 9 million refugees are a side issue, collateral damage, if you like.
They're just caught in the middle.
Yeah.
And of course, they're the biggest losers. I mean, and is there? Do you think that there's light at the end of the tunnel? Do we see that it could be over?
Yes, every now and then there's some flicker of light. I mean, right now the Russians are attempting a process and meeting with a number of government leaders in the Middle East. The Russians, of course, are very much on the side of the Assad government, but it's rare that you would find completely neutral parties. So it's possible that this might bear some fruit and you'd reach a resolution. Unfortunately, the Syrian crisis really is one that will find a solution not among Syrians but among outsiders, and how they deal and bargain things away. So I think ultimately there'll be a deal made between the Americans and the Russians, with the Saudis, Qataris, Iranians taking sides on either side, and they'll reach some solution that will be good for them politically. I don't know how much of a light that will be at the end of the tunnel for these refugees.
Is there a likelihood that Western countries have come quickly to the rescue, or to prove to the world that they're not Islamophobes?
No, I mean, I think Western governments have responded in the way they are because they're afraid of their domestic public opinion. That's it.
Yes, and they're also facing other issues like elections internally and those kinds of things. Now, what's the best and the lasting solution to this problem?
The lasting solution, of course, is a political solution for Syria. One that will find a way in which you can transcend the problem at the moment, move towards proper elections and a democratic future for Syria. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds, but there are lots of sticking points. So, big one is, should President Assad remain in power or not? And depending on where you stand, you have a particular argument. But that will solve part of the problem. You also have the problem of the Islamic State group and a number of other armed militias, which, no matter what political solution you find, have lost complete confidence in the politicians. And so if they've lost confidence in the politicians, whatever political deal is made, the fighting is not going to stop. If we have a deal next month in Syria, a political solution that all the politicians accept, I don't think the fighting is going to stop for another 10 years.
Yes, it's already deeply entrenched. Well, thank you very much for joining us and giving us this insight. Well, Naeem Jennah is the Executive Director at the Afro Middle East Center, AMEC, and he joined us now. Thank you very much.